collateral benefit. I think you just coined a word. It's just so cynical, and I thank you for it, and I'll have some questions when we get to it, but I do thank you for your testimony. Now I'd like to ask Kate Waters to provide.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I'm very pleased to provide testimony. My name's Kate Waters. I'm the Executive Director of Crude Accountability, which is a Virginia-based human rights and environmental NGO, and we work with communities impacted by oil and gas development. Our geographic focus includes the Caucasus, especially Azerbaijan, where we've worked closely with activists and groups on the ground since our founding in 2003. Our main area of interest is the intersection of environment, climate, and human rights in the context of oil and gas extraction, development, and transport. We do not work in Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh, so my comments today are focused solely on Azerbaijan, and I'm going to pay particular attention to the current human rights situation in the lead up to the COP29 meeting, which was already mentioned, and will be held in November in Baku. Just some brief background. I know we heard a bit of it earlier from the chairman and from others, but just to provide some context. Azerbaijan is a country of some 10 million people. Iran is to its south, the Caspian Sea is to its east, Armenia is to the west, and Georgia and Russia are to the north. It's an authoritarian country with most power in the hands of President Ilham Aliyev, who has ruled Azerbaijan since his father, who was the previous president, Heydar Aliyev, died in October 2003. The administration is rife with corruption, ranking 157 out of 180 countries in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, a global indicator of public sector corruption. Although official statistics put the percentage of the population living below the poverty line around 5%, unofficial data posits a much higher number. As one Azerbaijani citizen told Crude Accountability, "We are the richest country, we are the poorest people." Azerbaijan is designated as not free in Freedom House's 2024 Freedom of the World report, scoring 7 of 100 possible points. On political rights, about which I'm going to speak a little bit, the country earns 0 out of 40 points, and for civil liberties, 7 out of 60. In short, Azerbaijan is far from being a democratic, free country. According to Human Rights Watch, Azerbaijan has, quote, a persistent record of using bogus charges to imprison government critics, routinely manipulating and fabricating evidence. During the past year and a half, the government of Azerbaijan has cracked down in an unprecedented crackdown on civil society activists and journalists who it perceives act or speak in opposition to the authorities, using fabricated charges, violating the rights of those who are arrested, using torture and inhumane treatment. The government of Azerbaijan blatantly arrests, mistreats, and detains those it seeks to silence. As of June of this year, the Union for Freedom of Political Prisoners in Azerbaijan stated that there are 303 political prisoners. This number represents an increase of approximately 49 individuals since last December, and we know that since June, there have been at least 2 additional politically motivated arrests in Azerbaijan. The numbers are appalling, and they represent a harsh response to civic engagement by the government of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is party to numerous international human rights treaties which recognize the right not to be arbitrarily deprived of liberty, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Azerbaijan's own constitution and its criminal code prohibit the use of torture, yet according to testimony we've received from political prisoners and according to the U.S. State Department's country report on human rights practices in Azerbaijan, multiple credible allegations of torture and other abuse continue. Most mistreatment takes place while detainees are in police custody, where the authorities repeatedly use abusive methods to coerce confessions. Authorities reportedly deny detainees timely access to family, independent lawyers, or independent medical care. These statements from the State Department correspond to the information Crude Accountability has received from family members of those arbitrarily detained during the past year. The State Department report also documents use of torture, including beatings and threats of rape. The document documents harsh prison conditions, such as cramped overcrowding, inedible food, poor sanitary facilities, inadequate ventilation, and insufficient access to medical care. There are also reports of prisoners enduring lengthy confinement periods without any opportunity for physical exercise. Reports of arbitrary detention, denial of access to a fair trial, and trial procedures themselves closely resemble the accounts Crude Accountability has heard from our Azerbaijani colleagues. In addition to the State Department's reports, there is also extensive documentation by respected human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and in my written remarks, I've included links to these really important reports, and I encourage you to read them. There are also numerous media reports on the issue. I want to focus my additional remarks today on a few of the cases, on a number of the cases of arbitrary detention and mistreatment that have taken place over the course of the last year. I don't mean to single out any one case as more important than another, but rather to provide insights into the scale of the human rights abuses taking place in Azerbaijan and the scope of the inhumane, illegal, and violent treatment of civil society and independent journalists that is occurring. Among those arbitrarily detained and imprisoned are civil society activists, academics, scholars, independent journalists, opposition leaders, and others who are inconvenient to the Azerbaijani regime. The case of my close friend and colleague, Dr. Gulbadi Badoglu, has come to the attention of Congress, and I want to thank you for the actions that you have taken on his behalf and encourage you to continue to do that. Dr. Ibadoglu, who, as was said earlier, is an economist, civil society activist, professor, and scholar who was brutally arrested in July of last year by the Azerbaijani regime. He was accused of counterfeiting money for an organization and then later charged with having religious extremist literature in his office. Both charges are absurd, but they carry a maximum sentence of 17 years of imprisonment if he is convicted. After spending 9 months in pretrial detention, suffering in unsanitary and inhumane conditions, in which he was denied access to medication needed to manage severe medical conditions, as well as only limited access to his lawyers, Ibadoglu was released to house arrest. He currently must check in with the authorities twice a week. He's not allowed to work or travel and is still separated from his family. Additionally, he is denied medical treatment to control his diabetes and his hypertension. This denial of medical treatment is severely threatening his health, causing great concern to his family and friends. And in July, his trial was indefinitely postponed, meaning he's in limbo. This is reminiscent of the indefinite postponement of another political prisoner's trial that some of you may also remember, that of Khadija Ismailova in 2015. There are other cases. Anar Mamadli, a civil society activist and human rights defender, was arrested in April of 2024. The charges against him are very similar to those against Dr. Ibadoglu. Journalists with Abzaz Media and Toplum TV have been swept up in the crackdown. A year ago, approximately, in Warsaw, Poland, at the Human Dimension Conference of the OSCE, journalists from Abzaz were there reporting on it. Those same people are behind bars as I'm speaking right now. Abzaz also has done very important reporting on a gold mine and on environmental concerns. These are not the only individuals arrested. Tofig Yagublu, Iqbal Abilov, Bahruz Sabmarov, and Bakhtiar Hajiev are also behind bars, as are hundreds of others who are wrongfully detained. And particularly, just my final comments here, in the lead up to COP29, this is extremely disturbing. At a time when the world's eyes are on Azerbaijan, and one might imagine that the regime had every incentive to present itself as a government that respects the rule of law, democracy, environmental protection, the Aliyev regime has doubled down on repression. Its absolute lack of respect for civil society, for independent media, for the rule of law is stunning. And yet the Azerbaijani government continues to enjoy a place in the international community hosting COP29, engaging in trade with Europe, including in natural gas, and participating in international events and meetings. Azerbaijan's environmental record and its work to meet its climate goals are also lacking. According to the World Bank, Azerbaijan is not on track to meet its climate targets, and even as host of COP29, the country has pledged to continue its fossil fuel dependence. You may remember earlier this year when Aliyev said that natural gas and oil were a gift from God, and the massive offshore fields of Azeri, Chirag, Guneshli, and Shah Deniz are being expanded rather than shrunk. A couple of recommendations. As the U.S. State Department country reports demonstrate, the U.S. government is fully aware of Azerbaijan's gross human rights record. Our engagement with the country should reflect that knowledge and include human rights front and center in dialogue with the regime. We ask that the U.S. Congress hold Azerbaijan accountable for its human rights violations. We ask that in the lead up to COP29, Congress demand that Azerbaijan immediately and unconditionally release the political prisoners who are arbitrarily and unjustly detained in Azerbaijan, including Dr. Ibadoglu, who is in desperate need of medical treatment. We ask that the U.S. Congress call for full participation by civil society at COP29, including those journalists and activists who are currently detained and imprisoned. A climate meeting without the presence and full participation of the regime's critical voices, including on corruption, climate, and fossil fuels, is not a legitimate meeting. We ask for sanctions against Azerbaijani officials who have committed human rights violations, including those included in recent global Magnitsky sanctions designations that have been provided. And finally, we ask that the U.S. Congress raise these issues publicly as well as in private diplomatic discussion, calling for justice and respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer
Thank you
questions.
so very much. And